details now. Former U.S. President Donald Trump formally accepted Republican Party's presidential nomination at the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee. Trump began his speech with his description on being shot at rally earlier this week and said only because he happened to move his head did he survive.
When I heard a loud whizzing sound and felt something hit me really, really hard on my right ear, I said to myself, wow, what was that? It can only be a bullet, and moved. I felt very safe because I had God on my side. I felt that.
Well, Trump also predicted incredible victory in November election as he called for an end to discord and division on the note of unity.
I stand before you this evening with a message of confidence, strength, and hope. 4 months from now, we will have an incredible victory, and we will begin the 4 greatest years in the history of our country.
Also, the helmet and jacket of the firefighter who died at the rally was displayed to the side behind him on the stage. Trump went on to kiss the helmet of Corey Cormentor, and a moment of silence was also observed in his honor. Melania Trump also joined Ivanka Trump, Jared Kushner and other family members in the arena. This was his first major speech since the assassination attempt. Donald Trump focused on most election campaign topics in his speech at the RNC, reminding the gathering that during his tenure, everything from security of the nation to its economy, he hit the ground running and laid out clearly throughout plans for his action on a host of issues. The most talked about was the issue of inflation, which has been a rallying point for the Republicans. Trump promised action on day one if he makes it to the White House.
Starting on day one, we will drive down prices and make America affordable again. People can't live like this. Under this administration, our current administration, groceries are up 57%, gasoline is up 60 and 70%, mortgage rates have quadrupled. Republicans have a plan to bring down prices and bring them down very, very rapidly. By slashing energy costs, we will in turn reduce the cost of transportation, manufacturing, and all household goods.
Also, Trump touched upon the issue of illegal immigrants, calling them invaders.
I will end the illegal immigration crisis by closing our border and finishing the wall, most of which I've already built. Most of the wall is already built, and we built it through using the funds because what's better than that? We have to stop the invasion into our country that's killing hundreds of thousands of people a year. We're not going to let that happen.
Further, Trump tried to rally the minority voters with him, alleging that the immigrants outcompete blacks and Hispanics for jobs in the U.S.
And you know who's being hurt the most by millions of people pouring into our country? The black population and the Hispanic population, because they're taking the jobs from our black population, our Hispanic population, and they're also taking them from unions. The unions are suffering because of it.
Well, true to his word, earlier Trump refrained from direct hits at the U.S. President Joe Biden, naming his just once, but hitting out at his policies for the last 4 years.
The term once. Biden, I'm not going to use the name anymore, just one time. The damage that he's done to this country is unthinkable. It's unthinkable. Together we will restore vision, strength, competence, and we're going to have a thing called common sense, making most of our decisions.
Trump once again repeated his earlier statements on Ukraine conflict and the Middle East situation, promising an end to hostilities in both the places.
If you took the 10 worst presidents in the history of the United States, think of it, the 10 worst, added them up, they will not have done the damage that Biden has done. Only going to use the term once. Biden, I'm not going to use the name anymore, just one time. The damage that he's done to this country is unthinkable. It's unthinkable. Together we will restore vision, strength, competence, and we're going to have a thing called common sense, making most of our decisions. Been part of. Nobody can believe what's happening. War is now raging in Europe and the Middle East. A growing specter of conflict hangs over Taiwan, Korea, the Philippines, and all of Asia. And our planet is teetering on the edge of World War III. And this will be a war like no other war because of weaponry. The weapons are no longer army tanks going back and forth shooting at each other. These weapons are obliteration. It's time for a change. This administration can't come close to solving the problems. We're dealing with very tough, very fierce people. They're fierce people.
And Caroline Malone joins us from Washington, D.C. for more on this. Well, Caroline, as he opened his speech, Trump pledged to be a president for all of America and a somber telling of the assassination attempt. Stunning departure from his pugnacious style, invoking religion and God during the convention of the Conservative Party. How do you see all this?
Well, absolutely, yes. He did certainly start off his speech in a way that was very different from previous speeches, you know, retelling and saying it was a painful story, but retelling the story of the near assassination attempt on him just a few days ago, and how he said as a result of that, you know, he plans to unite the country, and also that, you know, he appreciates every moment because of this near-death experience, you know, as many people have described it. He also made a number of pledges, but what we didn't really hear was, with all these pledges, what the plans are to actually get to these promised achievements. So, you know, everything from reducing inflation and improving the economy through to closing the border and dealing with immigration, through to solving the wars in Ukraine and in the Middle East. And we didn't hear any detail, actually, of how he plans to do that. And I think what we will end up seeing now is the reaction from the rest of the US, particularly from the Democrats, and particularly those that have in the past and no doubt will continue to do as well in the future, fact check Trump to make sure that people are getting the facts about what he said and whether what he said has been entirely truthful. You know, I think one example potentially of that is this chart that he had on the stage behind him. Now, he made reference to this chart because he said it was the chart that was put up during the rally when he was in Butler, Pennsylvania, that he turned to look at, which essentially meant that the bullet missed his head and only scraped past his ear, essentially saving his life. But this was a chart showing the numbers of people coming into the country illegally, he said, and it showed a low point during the last Trump administration. I think to add context to that, you know, we need to remember that during the last administration, it was COVID. And so people were not traveling around the world as much as they normally would. Right. And, you know, the Trump administration introduced something called Title 42, which has to do with an emergency health order because of the pandemic, which meant that people couldn't come into the country. You know, and that was true for a lot of different nationalities and not just at the southern border. So there's a lot of context and a lot of detail that people will now be challenging Trump about, wanting to really hear how he plans to do all these wonderful things that he's announced he'll do in this speech.
Right, Caroline, as you mentioned, there was a chart behind him. He returned to his signature topic, that was immigration, and his plans to launch what he said will be the largest deportation operation in American history, as he said that America has become a dumping ground. Also, he spoke about inflation, as you told us, and how he will bring down prices from day one. How do you see all that?
Well, I think that's for Trump to answer ultimately, how he can bring inflation down from day one. Inflation has come down, I will say, in the US over the last year and a half. It's certainly down from the highs of a couple of years ago. But the cost of living is still making a lot of people suffer here. And that's why the economy is such an issue that resonates with people, that resonates with voters. It's got a lot of Republicans really pushing for Trump to, for his support ultimately, because they want to see the cost of living become more affordable. Even though prices are not increasing as much as they used to, there is a wage gap. People aren't earning as much money comparatively, and therefore they're spending more on their expenses than they can afford to in some cases. So that is a huge topic that people can really, have sympathy with and relate to as well. The other is the border. And, this is something that Republicans have been campaigning on really for many months, if not years. It's a very strong Republican agenda item. This idea that, as Trump has put it, there are criminals coming into the United States, and those criminals are largely responsible for this crime wave that we are apparently seeing across the US. Now, of course, if you were to look at the data on that, there are a large number of people coming into the US, higher than before. But actually, clearly, there's a lot of crime that's happening within the United States that has nothing to do with immigration at the same time. And while crime is going up in some places, it's going down in others. So, the picture is a little bit more complicated than the one that Trump paints. Having said that, it resonates with voters. And it resonates with voters because the Republicans have been speaking about it for a long time, and including on conservative media, which, if you're a member of the Republican Party, often people will only be watching that media. And so that's the messaging that they will be getting. But certainly that will be another thing that Trump is challenged on in the days to come after this speech, making strong claims about he's going to close the border on day one. But people want to know how he plans to do that and what the ramifications of that will be. The other thing he's promised to do on day one is to allow companies to, quote, drill, baby, drill. By that, he means energy companies, oil and gas companies, giving them permission essentially to drill in a way that they haven't during the Biden administration. The Biden administration has been pushing more for emissions reducing plans, so things such as promoting electric vehicles. Trump's also promised on day one to get rid of that, to scrap the subsidies for electric vehicles. So in a lot of ways, a reversal of climate change measures.
All right. Also, Trump spoke about two wars currently waging in Europe and the Middle East and how it would have never happened if he was the president. But he made no mention of how he would stop either of those conflicts, proposing to cut off U.S. aid to foreign countries. Would this be a game changer for him ahead of the polls in November?
Well, you're absolutely right. He's spoken of these plans, but we don't have the details of how he plans to enact these ideas. In the last Trump administration, he was very strong on pushing NATO allies, those in North America and Europe, to spend more on defense. That became a huge item. In the last few months, he's threatened to not support NATO allies if they're not spending more. In particular, if Russia was to attack a NATO ally, he said he'd let Russia do whatever it wants, essentially, if people are not spending as much as they have pledged to as part of NATO. Now, there's a big change with NATO in the last few months and years because of Ukraine, because of defending Ukraine, and individual countries, not as a result of NATO, but individual countries within NATO have been supporting Ukraine. And at the recent summit here in the United States, a record number of countries are now spending more on their defense, which is largely to do with Ukraine and this concern about aggression from Russia. So, it will be interesting to see when Trump, speaks more on this item, if he has any details really of how he would, quote, end the war in Ukraine. Potentially one way would be trying to force Ukraine to accept where Russia is standing right now, the parts of Ukraine that it's taken in the eastern part of the country, and trying to force the leader of Ukraine, Zelensky, to accept that somehow. It's unclear really, though, how the Ukrainian people would ever accept that level of a ceasefire. So we'll have to wait and see what details the Republicans and Trump come out with.
All right. He seemed to be extremely confident anyways about winning the presidential election, and it ended with win, win, win. Thank you so much, Caroline, for all that information from Washington. And moving on, Eric Trump called his father the greatest fighter I have ever seen.
Under President Donald Trump, the swamp will be drained. America will be respected. Our cities will be safe. Our streets will be clean. And our border will once again be secure. We will have peace. We will have prosperity. Your hard-earned tax dollars will enrich a better America, not be squandered in corrupt foreign nations. Education will be handed back to the states. We will no longer be 30th in the world. We will be first. The whole world saw your strength as you stood up. You wiped the blood off your face. And you put your fist in the air in a moment that will be remembered as one of the most courageous acts in the history of American politics. You shouted, "Fight! Fight! Fight!"